Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Kenny Chesney called Cosmic Hallelujah. You know, I don't think I've ever been entirely too fair to Kenny Chesney. Granted, there's kind of a limit about how fair one way or another a critic can be about this guy, because for as long as he's been a consistent presence in country music, he's not exactly been an artist that sparks a lot of attention, critical or otherwise, even despite a considerable number of hits. Outside of your average Jimmy Buffett fan club, I don't really see many country fans in the mainstream or otherwise saying that their favorite artist is Kenny Chesney. Hell, he's got a crossover hit right now with an artist that I otherwise like, and yet I can't really be bothered to care about it all that much. It's breezy, lightweight material, it's often set at the beach, the sort of sedentary music that goes in one ear and right out the other. So when I started getting requests to cover this, well, suffice to say I didn't exactly have high expectations. I may have been a little overly harsh to Kenny Chesney's last album, The Big Revival, which did have a few songs like American Kids that ended up growing on me a little bit in time, but I wasn't really holding out a lot of hope for Cosmic Hallelujah. For one, the lead-off single was Noise, the sort of non-country song, complete with some of the most gratuitous pitch correction I've heard in the entire genre. Whatever that song was, it certainly reflected a change in instrumental direction, perhaps even a point where Kenny Chesney decided that he wanted to blaze his own experimental trail. Sure, it didn't sound good, but it could be something interesting. And while part of me had no expectations that this is going to work well at all, he's only got 2 writing credits on this release after all, even though he is one of the executive producers. I will admit that it's a bit of an interesting spectacle to watch Kenny Chesney, of all people, 17 albums into his career, decide to venture out of an extremely well-worn comfort zone. So, okay, what does this mean for Cosmic Hallelujah? Well, I can say this. It was a big mistake to give Kenny Chesney more credit, because this is supposed to be more experimental or a step outside of his comfort zone. It's one of the laziest, most intellectually bankrupt records I've heard all year, especially from country music in 2016. This is the sort of record that flirts with some real ideas, but then backpedals so quickly into the most cheap sort of cop-outs. The album that wants to get credit for embracing change and big ideas while putting in none of the actual work to challenge the established formula or say anything interesting or new, coupled with instrumentation that alternates between being bland, stale, or completely miscalculated. Folks, I was preparing myself for the sort of tentative, experimental step that we've seen to mixed results from Dierks Bentley or bad results from Keith Urban this year, but this album, it's worse than all of them, because yeah, Cosmic Hallelujah, it sucks. A lot. And you know, it starts right from the top with Kenny Chesney himself. Look, I'll admit it right now, I've never been entirely fond of this guy's vocals. He goes broad, but he's never had the over-the-top personality of a Toby Keith, or the pipes of a Keith Urban or Chris Young, or the organic charisma of a Zach Brown or Dierks Bentley or Jake Owen or Brad Paisley or even Blake Shelton. Now, he does have some charisma. His career wouldn't have lasted this long if he didn't have some presence in the mix, even if his brand of lightweight beach country doesn't really demand it. But Cosmic Hallelujah definitely highlights the sharp limits of his dramatic range, which can feel painfully limited, and that's a problem given the subject matter. That's before we get to the blatant auto-tune of Noise, or that odd Dierks Bentley impression he was doing on Rich and Miserable, or the pseudo-rapping he was doing on Bucket that might be one of the most embarrassing things he's ever done. Seriously, between the filters on the bridge and the odd emphasis on certain words, comes across stilted as all hell. It's very telling that even with Pink really phoning in her contributions to setting the world on fire, she still was able to give a more layered and compelling performance than, well, Kenny Chesney was on the entire album. And then we get the production and the instrumentation, which is arguably the most agreeable part of this record, and that it's mostly inoffensive, if not particularly memorable. The acoustic and electric guitars are loud without having a lot of real crunch or serious groove. The drums alternate between being barely noticeable and obviously programmed, and the backing vocals are either these female vocals that are pretty unimpressive, or in the case of Rich and Miserable, sound like they're imported from a bad ex-Ambassador song. It's really jarring. And yet, as for much as this album is going for this sort of anthemic swell, it just consistently falls flat for me, and it's really for a variety of reasons why. In some cases, like Setting the World on Fire, the cloud of hazy synth and fake sandy drums just run with the song lacking any sort of color or spark. Similar case for the over-processed Noise, or the borderline trap snares on Rich and Miserable, or the overdubbed haze of Coach. In other cases, the layers of guitar are so close to the front of the mix, they slip these odd tone tones bleed through, like the flattened buzzy riff on Bucket, or the distant clanking that's midway through Bar at the End of the World, or the blatant American kids rehash Some Town Somewhere. And sure, I'll give Kenny Chesney some points for actually bringing in a pedal steel on Jesus and Elvis, but there's a part of me that feels like it's too little too late. An attempt to inject melody into an album that long ago subsumed any primary driving tone that's memorable into the haze, or tried to beef it up for only to fall further flat. So yeah, don't expect any sort of experimentation or switch-ups here beyond clumsy missteps towards an overly processed mainstream sound that already feels stale. But okay, here's an open question. For as much as Kenny Chesney likes to fly that pirate flag, why do we never get any sort of rough rollick to his material that might be reminiscent of that seafaring sound, add a little bit more groove to it? Sturgill Simpson got that right on one song, Sea Stories, the first time this year, and yet the most Kenny Chesney ever delivers of that is this choppy acoustic sound that barely has any groove, and then he's long ago driven that into the ground. But no. If we're gonna look to the fundamental issues with this album and why it really pissed me off, we talk about lyrics. Because Kenny Chesney, he's trying to say things with this album right from the very first song. And that message is, hey, the world could end tomorrow, and global warming is raising the sea levels, but you know what? I like the sea anyway. It's not like I can change any of it, so let's get drunk and stop thinking about it. Okay, now before we go on with this, let me unpack everything wrong with that statement, that message, that idea. Number one, I've never seen any evidence that Kenny Chesney has ever contemplated these sort of heavier themes and subject on album before. Two, way to trivialize an ecological catastrophe that we as humans have caused and that we could take steps to fight against. And three, way to take the easiest way out of any sort of deeper subject matter. I'd think about it, but that demands effort and contemplation. That can make me sad. I'd rather get drunk. Worse still is the framing. There's no trace of melancholy, no sense of reflection or disillusionment. Just a sort of vapid ignorance that you might get from a bad Pitbull song. And the general disinterest and laziness becomes a big issue whenever this album wants to try to make a point about anything. On noise, he does your standard information overload in the digital age rant, and yet instead of actually sticking to a coherent point or stepping away from all that noise, he says the only way to be heard is to contribute even more noise. Bucket is particularly obnoxious, where he follows in Blake Shelton's footsteps of flat-out incorrect spelling and grammar references in the lyrics by making a bucket list, turning the B into an F, and then blowing it all off to get drunk again with his chillaxification. Except he actually dumps his bitch-lying lover. Wow. Then there's Rich and Miserable, which seems to be trying to rail against the failed American dream, but between the political references and the awkward juxtapositions, it rings as more confused than anything. Doesn't really coalesce into a consistent point, especially coming from Kenny Chesney, whose net worth is an estimated $225 million. Dude, you succeeded in your American dream. Am I supposed to buy the sort of whine with the we pronoun there? They can't even bother to make a coherent point? And that laziness shows up in other ways too. The borderline bro country checklist hookups and parties of Winnebago, all the pretty girls in Some Town Somewhere, to the incredibly overused pirate iconography at Bar at the End of the World that long ago stopped making any sense, to the solemn song dedicated to former coaches called Coach that was so painfully saccharine and yet so overblown and non-specific that I can't even remotely sympathize. And this is coming from a former athlete who will unironically watch sports movies. And here's the main problem at the root of all this. With that sort of lazy framing comes the sort of detachment and disconnection that utterly cripples any sort of dramatic swell of these songs and renders any sort of actual deeper connection or insight completely superfluous. It means that it doesn't show that he actually buys into this material. So if he doesn't care about these big messages, why should we? It's why Setting the World on Fire can't think of greater stakes beyond just getting drunk and high on the street and into hotel rooms. Sorry, that's not setting the world on fire. Or why Jesus and Elvis sets up a bar started by a mother of a deceased veteran and dedicated to all the things he loved, and yet it can't help but feel kind of tacky around the cottage industry of Elvis, and more about the image and tenuous parallels between the King and Christ than any of their pain that actually lingers on in this mother character. Now, could these songs have worked if they were framed a little tighter, a little smaller, a little rough around the edges to bring in some vestige of authenticity? Well, maybe, but that would also probably come with more tight writing or a more nuanced performance, neither of which Kenny Chesney has any interest in delivering here. And look, I know what you're all thinking. Kenny Chesney, he barely wrote any of this album. What's the point of getting angry agree about this. It's not like he's trying for any sort of grand artistic statement. And for about a third of this album, the lightweight party stuff that's basically interchangeable with the rest of his discography, I would mostly agree. But the rest here, it is trying to say something, and it's so lazily framed, badly written, sloppily produced, and flatly delivered, there is no excuse from this, especially for an artist who's lasted this long in this industry. Again, this is his 17th album, so yeah, 3 out of 10, easily one of the worst country albums I've covered this year, and no way in the 9 hells am I giving this a pass, especially when so many critics and otherwise will give this guy a pass for making a statement. Yeah, it's a statement, alright, of laziness, detachment, and with all our luck, complete irrelevance. Skip this! So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, I know, last time I covered Kenny Chesney, I lost subscribers, probably gonna lose more with this, but I'm sorry, this album is garbage. I have no patience for any of this. You've been in the industry 20 years and this is all you're giving us? I'm sorry, this is... No. I got the poll up here, you guys can say your opinions otherwise, but I am not forgiving this record. It completely wasted my time. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I will try to give them a listen. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.